continent were on stolen land and sovereignty was never ceded. And, you know, we're talking about dismantling white supremacy in universities tonight, but that starts, like with every issue or challenge we're talking about in this country, we're centering the sovereignty and self-determination of First Nations people. So yes, I just wanted to start with that. And then, like, in terms of the actual question around when did I first realise I needed to be more visible in the conversation around white supremacy, I think, like, the challenge is not finding a moment, but choosing which of the litany of moments you want. And it's like you've got a new moment every day as a person of colour. And look, if your lived experience as a person of colour, you're guaranteed to have at least one, most likely many experiences of racism over your time. And growing up, you know, my childhood was littered with racist abuse and bullying. My first name became Chink, go back to where you came from, became the weekly mantra of the playground. You know, fruit was thrown at me from passing by cars. A whole litany of experiences that showed me that people were prepared to treat me differently because of the colour of my skin. And as I grew up, I started to realise that actually the story was a bit more complicated than that, and that my story of racism was only a small part of a much bigger shared story, a story that's more than 234 years old, rooted in ongoing and historical colonisation.
Definitely. And Angela, on to you.
Hello to everyone from Nottingham in the UK. I am Martinez D. My heritage is Filipina American. I was born and raised in Seattle, which is traditionally the land of the Duwamish people. I live here in the UK now, and having recently had to take the Life in the UK test, which allows you the permission to stay here without having your visa tied to employment or study, I had to do some research into the history of the UK, and it turns out that the UK land has been continually colonized by migrants who have taken the land for themselves. So we have a history here. The Celts, the Norse, the Normans, and then finally the Angles and the Saxons, and the Romans. I can't forget the Romans. So I think the British history in particular makes discussions of colonization relatively awkward, because there isn't that same understanding and same knowledge of a recent history of colonization of their own land. But of course there is the recent history of British colonization of 220 other lands, which is where normally we have to take the conversation after that. I'll pause there.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. Now that we've all done our acknowledgement of countries, I really want to bring it back to what we've just done. And Virginia, I want to ask you, what does it mean to go to a university on stolen land? And how do you think that's connected to white supremacy and the conversation we're having today?
Well, I think it's always been a very difficult space for Indigenous Australians to come to university, because many times your identity is challenged, because the very first time you actually walk into a classroom, you're not seeing people from your community teaching you. And you're certainly not seeing people that you know from your childhood, or people that respect you or know much about you as a person. And being on stolen land is a reminder when we look at the trees that are on campus, and I've been to a number of universities to study, and I still look around me and wonder why that river's been diverted on campus, or why we've planted a lot of exotic trees where we should be celebrating bush foods and bush medicines. Aboriginal flags are only one symbolic example that doesn't really give us the feeling of place. It's really to have that embracing that spiritual presence. And I think we're always cognizant that we're on stolen land, even as our own peoples, because I'm on Dharawal land now. But, you know, I always say to my kids, and also like Tim, they went through all the racism and the N-word, which was really shocking. And so I understand that. I was bullied as well, so I understand that as well. But I think that being on stolen land is always a reminder in all of your classes, where you go to lunch, where you go and sit down in a quiet place on campus. And that goes for any campus across Australia or across the world. You know, as Angela was saying, you know, in the States, there were land grants. And that also comes back to being stolen as well. So there are always reminders for Indigenous Australians that it's a very different space than when you're at home or with the comfort of friends and family. So that whole experience of stolen land, stolen waters, which is one of my specialty areas in law, is so strong. You know, the water quality, for example, when you think of the way that we treat water resources, you know, and we look on campus for some connection to that water space on campus, and it's not there, or it's been changed, or it's dirty, or, you know, there's all of those experiences that especially came back to us in the fires. Australia had really shocking fires from the end of last year. And I can tell you that, you know, when you're in Canberra, and you probably remember this, you know, it was like a war zone. It was sort of like a B-grade American film. And I know, you know, at home it was exactly the same. And it wasn't acceptable because, you know, not only for us was it so appropriate to know that there's cool fire farming and fire practices that have always been there and always been available if people had wanted to actually acknowledge us on country and to partner with us. But, you know, that's another sad feature of the last 6 months. So not only were we on and are we on stolen land, but many of the practices that could revive and could protect the land from being a fire emergency could have been changed many, many years ago. So, you know, we still have to keep on with that message that we're here, we have knowledge, we want to partner with you, but, you know, it's not there just to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you have kind of sort of almost answered my next question for you, which is, how can we better acknowledge and pay respect to the stolen land we receive on our education on? Beyond just, you know, the acknowledgement of country, you speak about not only this personal feeling of alienation, but also the bigger need for alliances, the bigger need for the benefit of even admitting that we are on stolen land and making use of the practices that these Indigenous peoples do, in fact, can provide to us.
Well, I think a really important part of going to university is also engaging with the traditional peoples that are in the area, you know, and there are community events and there are certainly places and people to meet in your community. We have something which is called the Reconciliation Action Plans. Now, many times I'd be asked, how can we actually improve the engagement and the knowledge that many people don't have? And I'd say, well, just humble yourself and go to community and say, look, I'm here to listen. You know, I'm not here to bother you, but I actually want to know how I can help you. And I sit on the ethics committee at ANU, and the one thing is many people don't have that experience or knowledge of Indigenous Australians, but yet many times people give the impression, not only because of being an academic, you know, you really want to think that you've that you're in control of your academic profile and your career, etc. But what happens is that there are many issues that people are unaware of, because in Australia we don't teach Aboriginal culture by Aboriginal people, for example. It's not widely done. And then you go into high school, and many of the people that you meet are not going to know very much about Aboriginal people. They might be writing or reading about Aboriginal people, as we do in the academy, but, you know, it's not presented by an Indigenous Australian. It's not informed by Indigenous Australian writings or even social media or YouTubes. And I know in my College of Law class that I taught last year, I really wanted to bring it home that many of the people are your age, you know, they're in their 20s, and they've sat in a police cell and they've been alive one moment, and the next minute they're on the concrete floor, and hours later they're dead, you know. So, I mean, that's what we're trying to bring home, that being an Indigenous Australian is very complex because the settler history is very complex. And Australia Day, for example, is on the 26th of January. But for myself and my family, we don't celebrate Australia Day. I don't want to go to a barbie. I don't want to go and have an egg roll. I really think that that experience just makes me more sad. And, you know, it is an issue. And there's other issues such as NAIDOC Week. You know, we have a celebration of Aboriginal culture during July. But then it's over. So once you've had that week or 2 weeks of NAIDOC Week, everybody goes back to let's not talk about any of those Indigenous issues again. And sometimes it's not intentional, but you know, usually it's having just that space to celebrate. But we should be celebrating every day of the year, because without that pristine environment that everybody walked to and walked on in this country, and the beaches that you see and the forests that you see, it was all there because of the most incredible land and water management and sea management of Indigenous Australians. So, you know, that's what I'd like students to really be active in, challenging those concepts in class. The first experience that I had when I was doing law classes, and I was a mother of 4 children, and I was doing 3 degrees at the same time and working full-time. So Tim, full-time mum, but full-time work. And you know, doing 3 undergraduate degrees, I did 14 subjects, I did 3 in summer session. And you know, that was really huge. But I can say in all of those experiences in the law class, there was only about 5 seconds, 10 seconds of native title and some laughter about, you know, a man holding a spear, that one of the comments from one of the law students. And the 3 Aboriginal students, and we were mature age, we sat there and just felt gutted, you know. So I think that it has to be up to all of you doing degrees and postgrad to really be active, and really be active to say, well, you know, I actually want to hear this from an Indigenous Australian. I want to have readings by Indigenous peoples. I want to have critical Indigenous theory taught by Indigenous people. You know, I think that that's what we need to do across the world, but certainly in our own campuses and across Australia, we need to demand that. We need to have that space, because I know that the lived experience is so much more powerful. Like yourselves watching tonight, you've all got experience. You've all got an understanding of how racism impacts, right? So how much better is a learning experience when you've got that safety of being able to share in class without being different? And I think that's what Tim was saying. You know, my kids were treated as they were different, but this is their country. You know, they can't go home anywhere. And we should be welcoming, as we should in every circumstances, people that do come here and have got big hearts and certainly want to sit and listen and have that humility, you know. So I think that that is really an important space to be in.
Yeah, definitely. I think as someone who studies law, I definitely resonate to what you said. I'm not Indigenous, but as a person of colour who was interacting with, you know, Mabo number 2, for instance, and you realise it's only talked about for 2 minutes in your first semester of university, and then it's dropped after that.
Yeah.
Moving on to one of the other pillars almost of white supremacy in educational institutions, which is racist iconography and symbolism and statues. The ANU currently has a Winston Churchill statue and bust on campus that is funded by the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. And Virginia, I want to ask you, why is iconography like a Winston Churchill statue so offensive to the conversation around white supremacy in institutions?
Well, I think, you know, a couple of months ago, before all the fires and the craziness, we had our Prime Minister talking about spending, I think it was $50 million on Captain Cook statues. Now, Captain Cook is not somebody you want to celebrate. He loved astronomy, and he took a ride to Australia basically to enjoy his pastime. He certainly wasn't here to make lives more much better for Aboriginal people, let's put it that way. So those areas of symbolism are really critical for us, because as I saw after George Floyd had been murdered, having those statues of Robert Mulligan which was a man who had benefited from slavery and been in control of slavery, many people had then thrown that statue into the river. And I thought, well, Captain Cook is no different. And no different than Winston Churchill knowing that background with Rhodes, for example. It's just a symbol of racism. And personally, I don't think that we should really be accepting that anymore. And I think that we certainly shouldn't be spending millions of dollars on Captain Cook statues. And I think I heard from one Aboriginal person on the radio saying, well, if they're going to keep those statues, let's have a statue of an Aboriginal person. But it doesn't really make it right. It doesn't allay the problems I have with having statues. And many of them, they don't have statues of women, and they certainly don't have statues of diversity, transgender, or, so it can become impossible really just to lean on the idea of accepting that symbolism. And I think it's really part and parcel of growing up as a country. I think we should say, well, that might have been celebrated in the 1900s, but we don't accept it anymore. And I think there's so many rules now that we have about, not harassing, not bullying. The Me Too movement was so powerful. And, a lot of women had immense courage. And we're saying, well, we don't tolerate that anymore. And the same example with the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse in Australia. We're saying, look, we don't accept that secrecy anymore. We don't accept the non-disclosure of those issues. So I think that really statues fit right within all of those areas. And we must really grow up. Those sort of statues aren't artistic, and spending more money on them. If they're graffitied, are people sending us a message? Perhaps we need to listen. Those are the sort of things that I really ask people to think about. We should be spending money on social housing and the homeless. We shouldn't have any homeless in Australia. It really breaks my heart to see that. So spend that $50 million on women who have to flee domestic violence, for example. Give the refugees the $50 million. But why on a statue?
I mean, you make a very valid point here, which I think we can encapsulate into the one phrase you say that hit me very well is just grow up. And you've kind of answered, our next question, but I'm going to open up this question to the rest of the panel as well. We've talked about why racist iconography is so offensive to minority communities, but what do you think your solution is to this racist iconography is, and why? I mean, there are so many different ways that people talk about that we can go about this. And at the end of the day, the conversation really comes down to what we as a department are going to have with the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, who may not see our side of the perspective or narrative. So what do you think your solution is? Tim, let's start with you, and then let's go to Virginia, and then Angela.
Well, I mean, I think the solution's pretty simple, although, as you sort of said, the Winston Memorial Trust probably wouldn't agree. And it would just get rid of them, remove them. They're from a bygone era. They represent and symbol. They're monuments to white supremacy. I think you just need to be straight up about what they are. And when you are doing that, I think you realise that that's probably not something you want in your institution. Or in an institution or any sort of environment you want to be proud of. So I think the main thing I want to talk about, I think everything that Virginia said, I definitely agree with. The main thing I want to talk about is how we can be distracted by these debates, and I think it's careful to not get distracted by those debates. I think the status quo is very cunning and it's pernicious. And it's very good at seeding just enough to give the impression that things are changing without actually changing anything at all. And I think, when you look at what grassroots First Nations activists are saying, they're not necessarily calling for statues to be removed, although they certainly and obviously wouldn't stand in the way of that happening. They're calling for structural change. And I think we need to be wary of how debates like this are often used as a smokescreen to distract us. And I think it's the conversation's often First Nations activists are You know, we need to address the over-incarceration epidemic. We need to stop locking up kids as young as 10. We need to end deaths in custody. We need to stop destroying sacred sites to open up minds. We need to establish treaties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then white allies are like, you know, yeah, cool, I hear you. What we're going to do in response is like change the name of this brand of cheese. So like the response is not proportionate to the issue, and sometimes that's done like in a good faith way, but I think often it's done in a bad faith way that's designed to sideline and throw up a facade that distracts us from the very real material issues, like people who are dying, people who are children who are being ripped from their families, from community, from culture, from land, distract us from those issues. And so like this, it's like get rid of these statues and let's move to the stuff that actually matters.
I'd agree with that too. And I think that's the whole idea. And Angela, you've written on this widely too about really breaking down structural racism, you know, and systemic racism. And I think that that's one thing the three of us agree, and I'm sure everybody listening would agree, that it really is a distraction too with COVID. Now, when I wake up, and you're in Melbourne, Tim, you know, you're waking up and every day is COVID this and COVID that. And I'm not saying it's not serious. You know, we need to be careful. We need to be cognizant that our lives have changed, and I agree that we need to make sure this is not going to be the same old once it's, you know, reached its peak. We need not to be distracted by our phones every day with all of that media. We need to really be on track about keeping on making change, but structural change. That is so important. And we do have, and we have amazing activists in so many different areas. And I think what we've got to do and continue doing is everybody has their area of expertise and passion. And we can't be doing everything at the same time. And we have to choose in our hearts what we can really dedicate to and give support to for other people that really want to go on and really push through and make that systemic change. But I also really agree that we need to make sure that in the learning environment that young kids come into and then come into in primary school and high school, that we have equal education on the information that comes in about Indigenous peoples. Because if you go to a private school, there are private school rules. They don't have to teach in the same way as you have public policy around teaching in state schools, for example. So, you know, I think we need the right to an education under the United Nations that is equal in value and quality, not of less character or quality. And I think that's the most important thing, that the information should be there right when they go to preschool, when they go to primary school. If there's any hint of racism, that every principal has a duty and an obligation to make sure that it goes no further. I think that in high school, we need to also push through, because we're preparing people for university or other tertiary institutions or careers, that they need to really know what the world is like for people such as people who migrate to Australia or other parts of the world, and the difficulties that they face coming into a new country. And Indigenous peoples, even in their own country, I've had stories where they've told people who are Indigenous to go home somewhere that's not Australia. But, you know, we need to really educate young people, because I think that's where we need to concentrate. For older people that are very conditioned in their ways of thinking, it makes it much more challenging. They really don't want to let go to that old thinking. And I think that the most important thing is really to have that education for all of those young people and really ready them for university. So I can walk in and they're saying the acknowledgement of country in language, you know, and they don't have to say, well, I've never seen an Aboriginal person. I have no idea what they're like. You know, that conversation won't happen. That would be fantastic. I think that's what I would like to see change, and that would be really good systemic change, because future judges, future lawyers, future policymakers, you know, future business managers and owners will have a different perspective on people other than themselves. and where their lives is headed and how they've grown up. So I would like to see that humility and the humanity from those examples and that change.
And Angela, over to you.
Yes, hello. Yes, agree with what both Virginia and Tim have said. I feel that what we're talking about when we talk about statues is the level of discourse that is going on in our societies. And we, as somebody who has been taught to look at the world analytically, one of the things that helps me understand social processes is by understanding what is happening at the level of discourse and what is happening at the level of material reality. That's not to say that the two are completely distinct from each other, that they don't intersect and interact, because they absolutely do. And the distinction is really just, as I said, an analytical one to help you see what's the kind of tone of the conversation, what are the topics that are being celebrated, what are the myths that are being reproduced. And here I think about decolonial theorist, Jamaican-American Sylvia Wynter, who is still around, and I think we should continue to give her flowers while she is still here, and has committed a lifetime of thinking about how our humanness is shaped by things like myths, right? And she posits the notion of what's called the third event, which is when our societies started using myths to understand the world and to understand ourselves. And when we have statues that celebrate these out-of-date myths, these old ways of being, an era, a bygone era, as Tim has said, we're perpetuating a cultural reproduction of a society that you know, is actually being dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And when Virginia talks about education and the need for a different kind of education for young people, I think what she's saying is we are leading away from cultural reproduction into cultural transformation. We are intervening in the processes of cultural reproduction by changing the norms, by tearing down the statues and changing the myths that help us to make sense of who we are and why we're here. There are other things that we could celebrate. I think, you know, putting up other statues is maybe helpful, but also, you know, not the only thing that we need to do. I think more productive or more effective would be to take that energy that we've got and that we're putting into things like, okay, you know, give us this statue instead, and demanding material change, demanding resource redistribution, demanding shifts in hiring practices, demanding shifts in funding practices, scholarship practices. We could do other things that would actually more materially benefit, and that would still attend to the level of discourse, right? Would it still interrupt the conversation, but look for the ways in which we can, number one, reduce the harm that's being done, that's continually being done to people who are marginalized in society, and number two, make the opportunities for those people more numerous, more accessible, and more able to influence the way in which.
I think it's like interesting to reflect on, you know, just following that, while there's so much energy around taking down racist statues, but there's nowhere near as much energy around the conversation on police abolition. And like, so why is there a difference there? And like, I to be clear, I think these statues should definitely go, but it's like, I think people see, you know, try and find various ways to like create a sense that they're taking action and that like they're validating their anti-racist identity without like seriously doing the work that that identity requires. And I think this is like actions around like taking down statues, if they end there, can be that. It's like, let's take down the statue. You know, some people are like, let's take down the statue and it's a full stop. But it should be, let's take the statue and, you know, what's next? And it's all of these other things that need to happen as well. And I think that's where the conversation needs to go.
And I think that it's true too that when an Indigenous person comes into that institution or that school, that they need to have their culture and their very being celebrated. And I don't remember that at school. And my kids don't really talk about that positive experience at school, and they're in their 20s. So, you know, I just think that it's really important that we need to have that positive, not role models, but we need to have that positive mirror that we're seeing ourselves, and everything we experience is there to nourish us and to make us feel whole. And I think that's what a lot of the young students would say to me, is that, you know, when I go into a class, I just want to be accepted. I don't want to prove or ask people why I should be accepted. And I think that that's really so strong, that we need to have that space. And that also comes from an acceptance of seeing yourself and being engaged on the basis that you don't need to prove yourself or where you come from, you know, your heritage. Or, you know, I was very embarrassed when I went to New Zealand, and this person was asking this couple, but where do you really come from? And they were people of colour. And I thought, that is so offensive. You know, you feel like walking up and saying, please don't do that. You know, but it happens in Australia when people say, well, where do you really come from? Where's your heritage? You know, oh, well, right. But, you know, can you imagine when it's, we're attached to this country, we're connected to it by the very part of every being that we have as Indigenous peoples, that we're considered special interest groups and minority groups, and that our ideas of being consulted is very briefly or not at all. So when we're the first peoples of this country and we're on the lowest part of that hierarchy, it really becomes where people see no hope, and they can't see that they're going to be accepted as a really important part of Australia's history, because Indigenous peoples and our culture, for example, our language, when we walk outside, we see eucalypts, we see, you know, so many things that remind us of who we are. But we walk into that classroom and we're just not an Indigenous person, you know, because perhaps we don't look the way that they believe that Indigenous people should look. And African-American people have that same problem. You know, I think that we really need to make huge changes. It won't happen with only statues, but it needs to be a multi-pronged approach. So that's what I was saying before. We need to have people who can really take that charge and be very active on so many different fronts. And wherever your specialty is, you know, if you're policy making, you need to really be armed with the knowledge of frontier history and what was perpetrated on Indigenous Australians. If you're making a whole range of different health policies or education policies, you need to have that knowledge of what was perpetrated against Aboriginal people across this country and Torres Strait Islander people. Otherwise, you don't have a context of how to really make good policy or make really effective policy without understanding that.
Yeah, I think you've honestly again touched upon what we're going to be talking about next, and you're definitely right about the need for us to honestly educate ourselves and where we come from as Australians. I think we often go into a very brief conversation about settler colonial history in primary school, and we've talked about this as well, the need to educate people about Indigenous history, yet we don't know about Indigenous culture, we don't know about that context when we go into the workforce in the future.
And there's very few opportunities also to talk about the Indigenous present and Indigenous futures as well. I think you know, we tend to relegate the role of people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color to
we've had a bit of a technical difficulty. We're just going to wait for Angela to get back to us. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is about one of the things that the Are You Racist ANU campaign that has been advocating for is the need for BIPOC representation in academia. And this question was going to be posed to Angela and Virginia, but Virginia, feel free to go first. Why do you think having that representation in academia is so important and vital to the progress of the academy and also dismantling white supremacy? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit about lived experiences, but I think we can also go a little bit more deeper into that conversation.
So just to ask again, I just missed some words because it just broke up. So the idea of the representation is?
So I just wanted to ask you why you think having BIPOC representation, in your case, especially Indigenous representation in academia, is so important to the progress of the academy and also the dismantling of white supremacy. And we've talked about it a little bit with, you know, the lived experience, but I think we can go a little bit more deeper into that conversation.
Well, I think that's a good start. It is the deeper experience that we have, but I think that everybody in a class situation can really provide so much depth to conversations, but you have to be in a safe space to share. And that's the most important thing. So, you know, sometimes we really love to lead with our hearts, but we don't want to actually come out from a class or from, you know, being on a committee or participating in some other hierarchy within an academy that is actually going to break our hearts or break our spirit. And I think that that's something that everyone has to really guard against. It's really important to have the camaraderie of others with you. Many times people will want to have one or two Indigenous peoples that are hired, but what it is to have really a critical mass of people that really come together and can support each other in those times where some very negative experiences or reactions to things that you might propose might, again, you know, be very hurtful or be off-putting. And I think, you know, it's really important, again, to have that critical mass and that representation. And Australia is, you know, with Indigenous culture, it is really multicultural, and there's so much benefit in all of us really finding that humanity and sharing and understanding together. That is really important, and it's really important in the classroom to have that experience, and also a dedication to know somebody else's lived experience and what that's like. And although you can empathise, you mightn't be able to understand everything. I think it's really important that we really have that space of empathy. And I think that we, when we have associations in universities for a whole range of different issues, and we join committees and we join in these programs such as tonight, it gives people a voice. And that's what we've been saying as Indigenous peoples. We wanted a voice in the Constitution. We put forward the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We went through a whole range of different expert reports for that constitutional change. We talked about treaty that got rebutted by several prime ministers recently. So, you know, for us to pick ourselves up off the floor again and go, okay, so nobody's listening, I've got to push forward. And I've got to do that with the support of my colleagues or my friends or my family, but I have to find a reason to pick myself up again and keep on going. And that's what it's like at times. And it's a very, very difficult space, but I think that we need to actually find the essence of what really binds us and what makes us strong with those moments that we will always go through.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's really important to understand and empathize with experiences that aren't necessarily ours, especially Indigenous experience, but also coming to terms with the fact that I'm never going to 100% understand and being okay with it. And I think that, Angela, I want to come to you because you work as a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship. We had a little chat earlier about, you know, the effects of working in a business school, which is essentially capitalist at its prime. And why do you think BIPOC representation is so important in an institution like that?
Yes, thank you. So this will have to be my last question because I'm going to have to go. So I want to say in advance, thank you for having me. And it's been really great to be with you. I also didn't get to hear the first part of what Virginia has said. So if I echo anything that's been said, please forgive me. Representation is a start, but it's not enough. As my Black American friends have always taught me, skin folk is not always kinfolk. You need to have people who are not only representative of diverse societies, but also really politically aware and willing to challenge the structural white supremacy that pervades all of our institutions, but our halls of knowledge very specifically. It is our institutions are awash in white governance structures, which is a term that I've learned from my colleagues, Sadvi Dar and Jenny Rodriguez. Sadvi, who's in Building the Anti-Racist Classroom with me, Jenny Rodriguez, who works at the University of Manchester. We have a hard time imagining ourselves outside of the ways in which our institutions have taught us to work. Right? These are called logics, and our logics are constrained by our imaginations and our training and our, as I said, our cultural reproduction. So these governance structures keep us adhering to the rules in so many different ways that it's not only representation that we need, but we need people who are willing to first see that present for what it is and be willing to take risks to make changes, because it is risky to make change. So as an activist within the institution, at first, with Building the Anti-Racist Classroom, I didn't do my activism at home, at my home institution where I was employed, because I had to kind of cut my teeth in other places. So I worked with my collectives, and we were invited to lots of other universities, and we built up our strength, our knowledge, our courage, our ability to articulate these issues. And then, a couple of years into it, I'm now starting to be invited to advise my university and to the senior management in a strategic level about equality, diversity, and inclusion issues. But I wouldn't have been able to do that at home right away unless I had gained those skills and knowledge and courage elsewhere. So I think that that's something that might be worthwhile talking about is who do we need? We need people who not only look like us, but are willing to change the nature of the institution for us. And to make it more possible for us to live whole and happy lives in moving through the world. So I'm going to stop there. I've left my email in the chat. Nice to meet you all. A real pleasure, and I hope that your campaign goes really, really well.
Thank you so much for coming on, and everyone go check out the Building the Anti-Racist Classroom and the Decolonizing Alliance.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Angela.
Bye.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you.
Since we have two panelists left, we're actually getting in some questions. Tim, I would like to ask you this question. What is the most important thing that universities need to change regarding white supremacy that you think?
It's a big question. I'm sure there are lots of things. I'd be very keen to hear Virginia's thoughts too. But I think, look, there's simple stuff around hiring more people of colour academics and staff. I think Democracy in Colour, we do a lot of work with organisations that want to build a sort of racial equity culture. And there's like a trillion different ways. There's like a trillion different things that organisations will generally be open to. And the one thing they're generally not open to is like anything that costs money, like anything that's going to change the structure or more staff. You know, people are prepared to set up like diversity committees that are full of white staff because the organisation's full of white staff. They're prepared to like instigate another study. They're prepared to like ruminate and navel gaze until the cows come home and then some. But they're not prepared to actually do what is needed to do. Like it's not the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, but you do need more people. You do need representation. And I 100% agree with what Angela said. It's like representation is not the end goal. If you have like representation of people who are bad politics, and that's not much progress at all. But you do need more people of colour, academics and staff. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is like in organisations we work with where there is diversity, it's concentrated diversity. It's diversity that's usually almost always in junior positions and in particular teams, like maybe in the finance team or they're all accountants or whatever, not in programs teams or in communications or whatever. So I think it's really important that, you know, just hire more people of colour, but you ensure that people of colour are in decision-making bodies. I think it's really important that autonomous people of colour-led groups like the Ethnocultural department are funded to do advocacy with no strings attached, to be a body, to work with, represent and advocate for students of colour. I think there's a strong argument for embedding racial literacy in the history of colonisation in all courses, regardless of what they are. I think, you know, you need a shared baseline knowledge of racial justice. It's just because it's not taught in schools, and I just don't know. It's just like a key life skill. You know, it's like knowing how to do your taxes or drive. You just can't really live in this country if you don't know like the history of like more than 234 years of genocide, of dispossession of land, of stolen children, etc., etc. And I think, you know, to like, the last thing I'll say is to facilitate an honest conversation about the subtle rules and norms that privilege white people at the expense of people of color. Like, white supremacy in the 21st century isn't like the Ku Klux Klan or waving like, you know, masks around and flaming torches. Although that's, in the US, it's kind of still is. Which is one thing. But like, white supremacy in the 21st century is like subtle. It's invisible. It's norms and rules that subtly undermine the dignity and humanity of people of color, First Nations and Black people, and privilege white folks. So and they can only be drawn out in honest conversations that deeply interrogate what is the lived experience of a student, of different students at the educational institution we're talking about, and how can we make that as equitable as possible.
Yeah, and I think, just coming on from what Tim's saying, I really understand exactly what we need to do across universities, just having a look at some of those questions, was that groups such as the Ethnocultural Association and many groups like that on campus are really important right now. Because many of the issues is going to be sought for an answer to be budget neutral. In other words, no cost. So what you have, and many other people like you that really bring together all of these student associations, is the passion and the will to really stay firm and make change. So you have an incredible amount of power and passion. And remember that activism is really uncomfortable, but it's really important to make that change. And it's changing not only yourself into a much more honed and incredibly skilled and you know, an incredible person who really understands issues across the board, like Tim said, in Australia. So what you actually contribute to us as Indigenous peoples and many people of colour across university campuses is that passion and is that commitment. So even though you might sit here after you've turned off tonight and go, well, what can I do? Everybody can do something. And even if you feel a little bit weak or unsure, you can come together with a group of people and be incredibly powerful. And that's what Aboriginal activism's been about, whether it's been land rights and, you know, talking about water rights and human rights, for example. That doesn't stop. All of those issues are many. So as I said previously, you know, we have to choose where our passion lies and what we can speak about and where we want to grow and where we want to make change. You know, I've got a legal reform background, and that's really important to know that that will change. But remember, they didn't abolish slavery in 2 years. They didn't abolish it in 5 years. You know, people had to turn up to the Parliament in England and keep on pounding away why it wasn't right to own human beings. You know, and we have a modern slavery. We have a Modern Slavery Act in Australia, but yet we can't fully embrace the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and we can't ratify the Nagoya Protocols, which would also protect Indigenous IP. So just be passionate, stay the course, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much for those really kind words. I think the entire executive and also collective needed those very motivational words about the kind of work that we do. We've received this question from quite a few people. I'm just going to merge it into one question. I think we've touched upon it a little bit in this kind of conversation as well.
I've got to go, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Good luck with your...
And take care. Thank you, Tim. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
And Tim, that leaves you. Thank you so much for staying on. So I received this question from quite a few people, but I'm just going to merge it into one. Often we, as you know, people of colour within a community, especially students, feel like we don't have a lot of power within the ANU. And I think to some extent that is true, because there is a serious lack of communication between someone like Brian Schmidt, who's the Vice Chancellor of this university, and us as student activists? How do you put real pressure on the institution to support radical and meaningful political and, racial justice oriented change? And how do we best accomplish that? But also, what is the role of white allies in that fight?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, that's a very cool rabbit somebody's got on the screen. I wish I had a rabbit. Lockdown is the time for rabbits and pets. But so the essence of the question is, how do we apply pressure on the university to facilitate change? Is that right? And then the role of allies in that process.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, look, I think, this is just my opinions, take it with a grain of salt. And I think my answer is like multifaceted. I think the first component is like, you've got to believe you have power in order to have power. I think like you cede your own power. And I think like, one of the state has, has an extraordinary ability to create material harm to people and communities. But I think it has an even more extraordinary ability. I think like the worst way it impacts communities is like by convincing people that they don't have power. Like the state could do like through legislation, a whole bunch of different things, very terrible and harmful things. But I think the one thing that's like the most enduring and the most pernicious is its ability to convince us that we don't have a role to play in politics. That politics is the sole domain of like corporate lobbyists and ASX 100 companies and et cetera, et cetera. And it does that by like being extraordinarily incompetent, by like just politics that's just so uninspiring that it just turns people off, by making processes inaccessible, all sorts of different things. So I think like the main point there is that you have to believe you're powerful, otherwise you're not powerful, and you cede your own power. And because if you don't believe you're powerful, then you're not going to bother to like write a letter to the Chancellor or write a letter to your MP. You're not going to call your MP. You're not going to turn up to a protest. You're not going to send an email. You're not going to sign a petition because you don't believe you're powerful. And like that, you by yourself not doing that, maybe doesn't make a difference. But if 1,000 people believe the same way that you do, or 10,000 people believe the same way that you do, and then we're not going to win anything. So like you have to, the first principle you've got to like start with, I think, is that, I'm a citizen, I'm a consumer. You are. The like corporatization of universities is off the charts, and they rely on your dollars. You are valuable to them. You do have power collectively. And so, yeah, you're a citizen, you're a consumer, you have voting power, you have consumer and purchasing power, you have the power to like withdraw, your participation in institutions, you have the power to damage brands and reputations, which impacts, the profit models of these institutions. So I think like the broad answer around like how do you apply real pressure is like, one, you've got to believe you have power in the first place. Two, you've got to understand what that power looks like. Where do you actually have power, and where do you need power that you don't have power, and how can you build that power? Like a process of organizing, and then you go out and collectively organize to do that. I think like the thing there is like, campaigning and advocacy is not like a sole journey. There are no heroes in this. It's a collective effort. And the key thing, like I think, you really don't have power if you're by yourself. Like then you don't have power. But if you're like in a community of 100 people who all believe you have power, then you have a lot of power. And then 1,000 people, great. Even more, 10,000, great. So I think that's like, you've got to find ways to build agency, empower communities, and then find ways to take collective action together. And then the role of allies in that, well, I could think it's the role of like allies in everything, like the idea of an ally or an accomplice is like, maybe a potentially better word, accomplice, in terms of what we're trying to say here. It's not a position, it's not a role. Like you're not an ally. It's like, it's an action, it's a verb. You be ally, you allying, you accomplishing. And it's this idea that you gotta it's not like it's a journey, it's not an end result, and it's like showing up consistently, doing what's asked of you and creating space for impacted communities and frontline communities to speak and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, I think there's a very real role for allies to play in this, and it's like in the sort of, or accomplices, and it's in the nature of like what that should be, and it's taking action and it's supporting the leadership of frontline communities, and it's like working out what are the circumstances where if I take this action, it will have less detrimental consequences to me as if like a person of color or some other person did it. And so maybe I should do that. Like, you know, if it involves police, like, and you're a white person, then perhaps like you should be in a frontline role there. Or like your opinion might be heard, or there might be less like blowback or less repercussions or less gaslighting or whatever. Then you should consider what are those circumstances and what role should you be playing in them.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the questions that we've received is to do with the whiteness of the learning curriculum itself, which is a bit of a different kind of note with regards to this conversation. And it says, race courses are overwhelmingly taught by white academics. Some students have defended this because they're experts in their field. What are the panelists' opinion, well, in this case, Tim, you, how can students call out this lack of representation and actually be heard? And do you think universities are genuinely willing to value lived experience? I think it kind of ties into what we've been talking about previously, but what are your thoughts on race courses being taught by white people?
Yeah, and again, like, you know, I'm one person, so take with a grain of salt, multiple grains of salt. And like, I'd love to hear your opinions too on this, so if you can share them. But for me, I think like it's a good question. I just think like you can't, in something like race, you know, I just don't think you can be an expert on it if you're not First Nations or Black or person of color. I think there's like a real difference between theoretically understanding something, you know, reading about something in a book and then living it, and knowing what it's like to be dehumanized, knowing what it's like to have your dignity undermined on a daily basis, knowing what it's like to be, you know, be gaslighted or like have, you know, slurs thrown at you, be physically abused, verbally abused, all that sort of stuff. That is like very different. To like have viscerally experienced racism is very different to reading about it, and you just like there's no substitute for that, and so like you just can't substitute. You know, this is an emotional issue as much as it is like a fucking whatever the opposite of emotional is, like a logical issue. Race is and racism is like an issue of power, you know, and it's just like I just don't understand how you can understand. I don't understand how you can understand it if you haven't lived it, because you can read something, but something like race, you need to understand it. You know, you can't understand like what it does to your identity, what it does to like your sense of dignity, to your sense of self as a person, to experience those things unless you've lived them. I think that's one answer to the question. I think the other one is like, you know, is issues of space, and it's like why are you in this in the first place? I'm assuming if you're like a lecturer on racism, it's because you probably want to end racism, and you don't like racism, hopefully. Otherwise, that's a bit ironic. But and if you don't like racism, like, and part of your analysis should be like, well, part of racism is the fact that like people of color are excluded from decisions, and like what are you doing by being in a role that is like one of the few roles that people of color have seen as like explicitly qualified to speak in? Like you're just taking up space. And so, you know, if you're actually committed to anti-racism and like building a more racially just society, well then it probably means you should cede the space that you like, one, aren't qualified for, and two, it's like one of the few areas that people of color are explicitly seen. You know, when I get asked to speak on panels, like when people of color generally get asked to speak on panels, it's always about racism. Like we do other things, you know, like they're engineers, they're like fucking good writers, whatever. They can speak on a trillion different other things, but they're always asked to speak on racism. And so like, this is our area, get out of it. Like it's the one thing we're explicitly like able to do. And you're taking up that too. I mean, just please, if you can just leave that for us. I mean, that would be nice. Yeah, I don't know if I answered that question, but that was a bit of a ramble on a rant, but hopefully.
No, I think it was a great ramble and rant, and honestly, I think it validated how all of us as students have been feeling, especially coming from someone who runs a racial justice NGO. So thank you so much for that. We have 2 more questions lined up, if that's okay with you, and then we can
Yeah, sure.
wrap up. This one's a bit interesting. It's about international students, and I think that's something we don't talk about a lot because POCs are also often international students. Often when they come in to study at a university like ANU, they spend a large number of years at this university, but they're completely unaware of the history of Australia, especially when it comes to the way we've treated Indigenous people. What do you think needs to be done to educate international students on this, and how do we go about doing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not just international students. Like, one of the things that we try and do at Democracy in Colour is, like, you know, there's racism that we're trying to address in broader society, and with white people, and then there's like internalized racism and like the racism that different communities of colour perpetrate against each other, and especially against First Nations community, and also like the virulent and rampant anti-blackness that exists in some communities of colour. That like needs to be addressed. And so I think it's international students, but like it's also, you know, folks that have permanent residency and who were born here, that also don't understand the history here. And I think it's you start with the assumption that we live in a, you know, patriarchal, white supremacist, predatory capitalist society, and then people are socialized and conditioned from birth to act out in certain ways that perpetrate that system. And so like it's not, you know, this idea of like hating the game, not the players, and we're all players in this broken system. And like I think it's like, you know, it's almost impossible to like live an ethical life under capitalism. If you like start with that assumption, you know, that base assumption, then like it shouldn't be a surprise that people, whoever they are, act out in racist ways or like have internalized racism, because it's like that we were socialized and conditioned to act in those ways since birth. And so I think we need intentional, you know, courses and intentional programs that educate folks or people, and then different programs that educate people of colour specifically, and deal with the specific nuances there around the ongoing and historical, not just historical, but ongoing colonial violence that the state perpetrates against First Nations people, about anti-blackness, about you know, the struggles that refugees and people seeking asylum face, and all sorts of other different, you know, nuances that exist. You know, queer people of colour, women of colour, trans people of colour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these various intersections that we need to provide and give space to unpack. So like I just think, you know, it's just like I think the TLDR there is like to validate the assumption of that, the premise of that question, and to validate the importance of like programs that provide like real, you know, root causal analysis of the issues we're talking about here, and education, and provide actionable ways that people can move forward and next steps that people can take, and not just for international students, but for obviously white people, but also for other people of colour, any like non-black, non-First Nations person of colour, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. Final question here, and I'd like to bring in my little twist to this. The question says, what are your thoughts on playing the rules of the game in order to eventually reach a leadership position? To not speak out in order to not offend, and then when you reach the top position, you can effect change. That's the question. If we contrast that with how a lot of people view us as an ethnocultural department, as a bunch of angry activists who are shouting about something that just doesn't matter, how do we navigate both of those kinds of characters? Is there a mutual exclusive? Is there an intersection? Can you do both? You know?
So this idea of like working within the system, is that the essence of the question?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, look, I like believe social change is an ecosystem, and so we need a wide variety of people playing all sorts of different roles. People, you know, acting as citizens, like working within the system. People sort of trying to reform the system. People who believe the system is broken and are like trying to, you know, like change agents, trying to do some organising, but still broadly within the realms of the rules and the system. And then those like who are chaining themselves to the fences and the trees and the insert whatever you want to chain yourself to. And like boycotting stuff and all that sort of stuff. So like every, like, you know, and I think it's problematic. It becomes problematic when, you know, different actors like refuse to acknowledge the validity of other actors' roles, and like how that we are all essential in this broad project of social change. That social change, as like the other speakers, I think Virginia, you know, mentioned, is very long, it's very complex, and it takes lifetimes a lifetime, if not more, to accomplish it. And it's because like we're going against a status quo that has everything invested in maintaining the status quo. And so of course it's going to be hard. And of course we need a multifaceted approach to tackle it. So I think we need all sorts of approaches. We need people doing the, inside the system stuff, run for parliament, great, become a public servant, work within a big institution and try and change it from within. But we also need people who are doing community organising work, who are doing like direct action, non-violent direct action, who are, on the radical fringes. I think it's like important to think about which of those roles are more easily filled and which aren't. And like very easily, the roles that are more easily filled are the inside the system roles, because it's just more comfortable to do those. And so I think when you're making this decision for yourself, like think about, what is your value add? What's your best return on investment? And I think it's arguable that there aren't enough people who are doing the like outside the system work. There's heaps of people doing direct service delivery and education and welfare type work, but there aren't enough people doing like the hard political advocacy. And I think like the final component of my answer to that question is, I think I had a final component, but it has left my mind, floated away. But no,
it's quite late on a Friday night.
If I was going to say one other thing, I think it's like the caveat, I think, to like all roles are good within the social change ecosystem is that it's really important that we have the same like political analysis. Like I 100% support people working within the system as long as you have the political, like the political analysis that the system is broken. Like it's you can work within the system to change it, but like if you work within the system to change it believing that the system's okay or like just needs to be reformed a little bit, then I think that's wrong, because like, you can't hope for a solution if you haven't like accurately analyzed the problem to begin with. And like for me, it's like like my political analysis is like predatory capitalism is like fundamentally broken and wrong, and creates a system where we treat human beings as profit and loss calculators, and take what's most human about us, ingenuity, our imagination, our capacity to love, and enslave them to algorithms and spreadsheets. And so like I think if you can tackle that problem from a wide variety of different angles, but I think the shared political analysis is critical. And if you don't have that, then I think it's very difficult to make structural change, no matter what form of that, what role in that ecosystem you're playing.
Yeah, definitely. Yasmin, did you want to jump in here? Because
I look like I'm subverting the rules, but I did ask Nero for permission to unmute, so I'm not being annoying. So I was actually, Tim, I just wanted to clarify, I was the one who asked that question. I guess the context behind why I was asking you about playing the rules of the game is that, as an activist myself, I found that there's a lot of pressure, especially, I guess to not say anything in order to get into the place that you need to be. So for example, I know with my advocacy now, I probably won't be able to go into government because I'd be seen as too risky and too outspoken. And I've been also told, even by fellow people of color, that's something that you just have to accept. Unfortunately, you're going to have to bite your tongue if you want to operate in these environments, or else, you're not going to get that position, or you can't climb the rung. And I guess that's something that I'm working and thinking about, because we talk about going into government and disrupting institutions and politics, but in some sense that does involve compromising advocacy, in my eyes, at least to fit, to please the white gaze, right? Like to not come across as too radical and, too risky and that kind of thing. So I guess that was why I wanted to ask you about that, because I often say to young people, like, speak out, speak out, speak out. But, having negative experiences myself of speaking out and feeling pushback because I've been calling out organizations about diversity, I think it's just a tricky space. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of balancing act.
It's such an important point. And I think it's so interesting to reflect on, the status quo wants like people of color, like wants a particular type of person of color that only says X number of things in a particular way. You can only say things within the rules of the game, and in a polite, like all this tone police shit. And I think it's like Well, I think, you know, I think if I was reflecting on this, like my reflection is like, why are you involved in this in the first place? And it's probably like because you believe that X number of systems aren't working as designed, or are working correctly as designed, but they were designed to serve a minority at the expense, the perpetual expense of the opportunity and dignity of everyone else. And you want to change them. And like, if operating in a way that like pleases the status quo means that you can't, you know, you can only reinforce or perpetuate the status quo, then that's like what is the point, you know? There's this great, like, I saw this great meme the other day. It was like, you know, this idea of like, you're invited to the table, you finally have a seat at the table, and like the meme is like, the seat is like broken, you know, and it's like got 2 legs and is on the floor. So like, when you're saying that, that sort of like reminds me of that. Like, you know, you really, what is the point of being in those spaces anyway? Like, you can do things, yes, to get into those spaces, but like, if you can't actually critique or articulate a vision of like what you think is better than the status quo, which is the reason why you started doing this work in the first place, then why do you want to be there? Like, I think like we often say that access is power, and it's not. You can like be friends with a minister, or you can be, you know, you can like work in an organization and say the right things and be seen as like non-threatening, and that gives you access to, you know, a political meeting. But that doesn't change anything. Like, power is power. That's all. Power is, that's it. And, you know, like, power is multiple different things. It can come from, we like so often, and I think like in a flawed way, think about power in a literal form. Like, we think about the most powerful person as the prime minister. Well, like, yeah, like, he's powerful, but, you know, what about all of the donors in the Liberal Party? What about all of the power brokers in the Liberal Party? What about Peter Dutton? You know, what about the chief of staff in the prime minister's office? All of these other, like, the more like nuanced way of power. And I think like that's what we need to think about as well as advocates, is that, you know, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that we have to like follow the formal structures of power that are being laid out by the status quo, that we can build our own power, and like, we hold people to account. You know, we politicians play by a set of rules that are set by other people, not by them. You know, they're set by corporations, by big donors, by lobbyists, and sometimes, but very rarely, civil society. And so if we like are involved in civil society and do the work of building the power of civil society by organising marginal electorates, by building community support for our policy agenda, and being able to demonstrate that policy support, that it has tangible outcomes in elections, in terms of votes moved, et cetera, in the right places, then that translates into power on our issues. Like, I genuinely don't think like it matters what politicians think about the issue. Like, I don't care what a politician thinks about the issues I'm campaigning on. I care about what they're doing, and like, I can force them to do what I want them to do by like articulating that the political cost of them not doing what I want them to do is much higher than the political benefit of maintaining the status quo. And obviously, it's much easier to say that than do it. But that's like my theory of change. And I think like the last thing here is like, Yasmin Abdul-Majid is such a great example of what you're just talking about. You know, you can't get any more like model minority than Yasmin, like pre Anzac Day tweet. Like, she did everything right. You know, founded an NGO when she was 16, and she tells this story herself. So like, and she shares it with permission. Founded an NGO at 16. You know, Young Queenslander of the Year. An engineer. You know, very interesting hobbies like racing cars, all that sort of stuff. But like, it's a lie. You know, it's as soon as she put one foot out, said one thing that like the status quo didn't want her to say, she was literally chased out of the country. Like, we had senior ministers like calling for, you know, the sacking of her. You had like radio commentators saying like Prue, whatever the fuck her last name is, calling for her to be run over. You know, it's just all this shit. So I just think like the whole idea of staying quiet and the model minority, it's a lie. It doesn't actually exist in the first place. And even if it did exist, why would you want to follow it? Because doing so would like prevent you from like actualizing the vision you went into this space in the first place. I'm not sure if that answered your...
Yes,
this is like very late. I'm tired. I'm just like stream of consciousness here.
I think it answered our question, and we will let you go after this question because we've kept you here for so long. So that brings us to the end of this panel. I'm just going to do a very, very quick recap of 5 things that have stood out to me of what our panelists have said today. So the first thing is we need to grow up. Everyone needs to grow up. Everyone who's attending this panel today, but also everyone outside in the community, especially when it comes to our conversation about racist iconography. Secondly, don't get distracted by that debate. There is so much change that needs to happen. There are so many other conversations that we need to be having, whether it be going into conversations where we're informed by the Indigenous perspective, allowing for the continuance and the celebration of their culture, but also making part for the education of younger people about Indigenous culture in a way that mitigates racism. Thirdly, you need to believe in your power, and the more you believe in it, the more powerful social impact is going to be. And I really hope that that really resonates with all of us as a student-run and led department and also funded department. And I really hope we take that back tonight. And fourthly, stop taking up space. It's really high time that white people stop taking up space, and we make sure that we make room for people of color, for Black people, and for Indigenous people. It is high time that we start talking about it in a way that prioritizes our change over the fragility of white people, as we very openly explained. And finally, social change is an ecosystem, a very philosophical conversation, but also subject to the caveat that we all need to be on the same page when it comes to political analysis. But then also further, I think we need to really rethink the way that we think about power, but also the theories of change. And I think that really applies to the way we're going about dismantling white supremacy at the Australian National University. Brian Schmidt is not all. Julie Bishop is not all. And we need to be looking into more conversations about different kinds of routes we can take about this kind of conversation. So that was a really quick recap. I'm sorry if I was talking really fast. And that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. Feel free to follow us on Facebook for Are You Racist ANU. Our next panel is going to be an in conversation with American Egyptian journalist and author Mona El-Tahawi, who we are very excited to talk to. And finally, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you so much to Tim for taking the time to talk to us. It was truly so interesting to hear from someone who is also a young person of color. So thank you so much for that, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. And if I had a parting message, it would be, believe in your power and do something about it. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and the promise of democracy is that inequality of resource can be breached by equality of voice. And that promise is being perverted right now by big business, by lobbyists, by all sorts of different things. And the power of civil society has radically declined in proportion to those other entities. And the only way we can reposition power in a way that works for the majority of folks is by people like us getting involved. You can't say that politics isn't for you. Everything is politics, and you can say that you're not interested in politics, but you can be better. You bet every dollar in your bank account that politics is interested in you, and you can also bet every dollar in your bank account that big business and the lobbyist team and these mega corporations, they've got their mouths in the metaphorical and literal ears of politicians and policymakers. And so there was going to be a closing message is to get involved and to do something. It doesn't matter what it is. Join a political party if that's for you. Join an organization, whatever it is, on whatever issue you're passionate about. But do something. You can't sit it out. You can't sit this out because there aren't any heroes in this game. It's not about. It's every one of us taking action and doing what we need to do, playing our role, and that's how we win this. If any of us sit this out on any issue, we lose. The stakes are so high, everything is at stake, and also we're up. The odds are so high too. We're up against the wall here, and so we can't afford to not have any of us not involved in this. So please get involved, whether it is in the ethnocultural department or some other organization or whatever works for you. Just do something.
We received in the chat section, go join Democracy in Colour. I know that you guys can sign up. It's Tim's organization and they do fantastic work. So go like them, go follow them, and also more importantly, go join them. I know I will be. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.